Well, good morning everybody, and my name is Claydon-Smith from the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council, and I'm just going to give you a bit of a background to why we ended up here today. I will kind of start by saying that I'm going to concentrate on Epsrc, but this is actually an initiative that's of interest to a number of research councils, and as you'll see, that we started off with Epsrc and ESRC very much taking an interest in what we're doing. Because of the way things have developed, we've got potential interests from other research councils as well, AHRC, possibly BBSRC, possibly MRC, because of some of the directions the research has taken, all of which I regard as quite positive developments. But just to give you a sense of time, I think that's kind of the focus of what I'm going to cover this morning. And just to introduce Epsrc for those that aren't familiar with us as an organisation, we're a public body. We fund basic research in universities. We're one of a family of research councils. Our remit is the engineering physical sciences, so the large part of what we do is to support basic research in maths, physical sciences, physics, chemistry, materials, IT and engineering. So that's our core remit, and the bulk of what we do is funding to support curiosity or investigator-driven research in that remit. So that's the essence of what we do. Alongside that, we also support a number of strategic themes, very much addressing societal challenges. So, for instance, probably our longest standing initiative is research to support future energy technologies and energy systems. The area that I'm responsible for is called Manufacturing the Future, which is how all of that research can deliver benefit in terms of the UK industrial economy. So that's where we are today, but it's worth appreciating that that has a shelf life which expires at the end of next March. So we've just gone through a general election, and as public bodies, the consequences of that is that we then have to replay back to government our plans for the future. And that's the process that we're in at the moment. And it might seem a little bit odd, but that's the reason why you're here today, because the general election and the changes that result from it were very clear about 3 years ago. So we started our journey in terms of planning for future strategy around 2 years ago, and this whole initiative is very much part of that process. So the transition of these networks between the administrations and the agenda setting nature of the agenda was something that we did quite deliberately. So that, as I showed there, is how we are at the moment. It won't necessarily be how we are in the future. In terms of manufacturing the future, and my particular theme, what we look to do is Janus-like, look in two directions. So on the one hand, we look at what's bubbling along in the science domain, what's emerging from our science portfolio that could make a difference to manufacturing one way or another. And then we also look to what's going on in the industrial domain, what's going on in society, what are the changes there, and see what the pull factors, and then try to mesh them together. And the area that we're particularly interested in is this kind of magic box with this focus on product, process and system. And you see that reflected in most of the things we do. You certainly see it reflected in this particular initiative. So that was kind of where we were. This is kind of work in progress in terms of the ideas that we're developing to present to the new government as part of our future strategy in support of manufacturing. So the themes that seem to be emerging, and like I say, there's nothing dead certain about this, are that through our research we can see how we can contribute towards positive outcomes for the UK around digital manufacturing, and Fiona's covered a lot of this, in terms of thinking about how research can create new industrial systems, new way of organising industry, and again that's very much part of this agenda. Sustainability is obviously there, it's kind of a long-standing theme and it's not going to go away. And then the fourth area is about thinking about the products for the 21st century. If the 20th century was defined by things like cars, fridges, penicillin, nylon, and so on, what are the things that we need to be thinking about for the 21st century? And more importantly, how are we going to accelerate that journey from discovering new things to being able to use them in some useful way in terms of products? So that's kind of our work in progress and where we're going. And as you can see, there's a kind of a resonance already between some of the ideas there and some of the things Fiona's been talking about. But if we kind of roll back why we started the whole journey, what became evident about 3 years ago is that there was this emerging interest in new ways of thinking about industrial systems. You know, the 20th century was pretty much about the growth of globalization. And over that century, you saw global trade faster than global wealth, you know, grow faster than global wealth. That didn't happen through the 21st century. So what started to happen is that the pendulum towards globalization following the financial crash started to kind of shift the other way for some of the reasons, again, that Fiona talked about in terms of a resurgence of interest around localization and so on. So there are a couple of things that came out that kind of prompted this. This was a report that McKinsey did, and it's quite a good report, really well done, as you'd expect from McKinsey. But it's very much in the spirit of, if you had £1 billion, where would you invest it? And for management consultants like McKinsey, that's obviously their business. But what's interesting is that it's starting to think about segmenting industry and products and thinking about how you'd organise, where's the best bets, where are the best places to put things on. And it's starting again to tease out this issue about global versus local, and I suppose global, regional, local. So that was kind of McKinsey's view on the world. And I suppose the criticism I'd have of that is that there's a kind of implied, there's a lack of dynamism about that. It kind of assumes the world is the way it is and it will be forever. But anyway, that's my own view. The other significant development that's happened in recent years was the government commissioned a Foresight report. And I have to say, having seen 3 manufacturing Foresight reports over the years, this one was, for me, the one that was done best. It certainly drew on academic expertise across a whole range of disciplinary specialisations and pulled in together all the different perspectives and then did quite a sensible job at integrating it. But the report itself, again, started to think about how manufacturing was going to change. And I think that the pace of change was probably one of the most striking features about this. The idea that the world is going to be very different, I think, is probably the most significant feature there. And you know, one of the supporting reports actually looked at the whole regionalism and the future geography of manufacturing, and thinking about what's going to pull it this way or that way and how that might change in the future. This is kind of a bit more recently. In the dying days of the coalition, Nick Clegg launched this report. It's a bit of a shame, actually, because it's one of these reports that will, you know, given the change of government, will almost certainly be overlooked by the department. And it followed on from a number of studies and kind of lobby positions from the CBI and the Engineering Employers Federation around supply chains, which very much took a view on looking at materials supply chain. This report's much more interesting because it looked at a whole range of issues to do with how industry organises itself. So it went well beyond just material supply, and started to think about some of the issues that Fiona's talked in terms of the enabling opportunity around ICT in particular. And so that for me was quite a notable activity, even though it has been largely overshadowed by the change of government. And then this is, I suppose, within the last couple of months this came out, that the World Economic Forum, every year the future technologies kind of bubble up through the forum. And this year, a couple of things were of interest. Additive manufacturing was there again as kind of as kind of a future opportunity, but also it highlighted distributed manufacturing as one of the areas of interest. And I suppose there's a backstory for me on this, that when we started out, we used to talk about this initiative as distributed manufacturing. And the reason we shifted to redistributed manufacturing was because we were getting a lot of feedback from companies about the fact that manufacturing is always distributed. You know, and that's kind of the nature of the Industrial Revolution, if you think back. And what was more interesting than the, if you like, the dispersal of manufacturing are the things that are making it change. So that was, for us, the journey that we took from a focus on distributed manufacturing towards redistributed manufacturing, thinking about what's going to change, you know, what are the drivers on this. So if that's the context, how do we get to here? And so 2 years ago now, we actually organised a workshop in Belper where we brought together a whole range of experts from the Epsrc and ESRC communities with some industrialists to really tease out what's going on here, what's interesting here, and then advise the research councils on what we should be doing in the future. Out of that, we came up with a number of priorities, and this list here is quite interesting because we did that before we actually went through the network call. So that was our shopping list, or Mark's shopping list, if you like, for the call. And following on from that, we actually funded 6 networks, and these are interesting because they're all very complementary. They overlap, in my view, in a constructive way, but they all meet a discrete dimension on the issue. So some of them are very technology focused, like this one. Other ones are very sectoral. You've kind of got the food chain. You've got the city region as a focal point. So you're actually looking at different dimensions of the issue. And there's the RECODE one. The reason why we funded networks was, firstly, because we wanted to make sure that there was actually a research agenda behind this. You know, in life there are lots of things that are interesting, but just because something is interesting doesn't mean it's necessarily tractable through research. And even if it is something that can be useful through research, that doesn't mean it's going to discover anything that's useful. So the reason for us funding networks was to explore the subject in depth, prove that there's something here, and then advise us on what we might do in a more substantive way in future. So that's very much the objects of these networks. So just to give you some final thoughts, and I apologise for the people that have heard this before, when thinking about a future world and future opportunities, it's very easy to get carried away with things. So in the Claydon-Smith household, we don't buy bread anymore, we buy ingredients, and that's my home bread manufacturing machine. And mine's actually made by Panasonic, not Miele. But it's fair to say it's unreliable, it's time consuming, it's certainly not sustainable because of the energy cost, but it serves our need. You know, it serves the needs of us, and it's sufficiently niche that Panasonic and the like supply the machines to do it. But it's never going to put Hovis out of business. Right. And in this agenda, it's worth thinking about. You know, the solutions don't necessarily need to be universal. You know, within its niche, this serves the purpose, but it's never going to transform the whole industrial system. But one of my directors used to be R&D director for Kodak. And the thing about Kodak is that they went into Chapter 11 bankruptcy. They've just come through it now as a very different business. And they, as a company, were largely destroyed by the fusion of technologies. You know, they were the world experts in silver chemistry, and the combination of mobile phones, home printers, and Facebook just destroyed their whole business. You know, that whole consumer-led kind of innovation took them away from it. And the great irony, of course, is that a lot of the technologies that took them out of business were ones that they developed themselves. So, you know, there are opportunities. And for me, in particular with this network, the interesting thing was the way that the combination of technologies coming together at the right time were the really disruptive element. So that's enough from me. I hope you enjoy the day. But the one thing I just really would reconfirm with you is that this is important to us as a research council because we are going through our transition. So the advice and ideas that you generate will be of use to yourselves, but they're also of use to us because we're trying to make our way in terms of our future strategies and presenting those to government. And so we're very much looking for the output from today and other days to be helpful in that context.